Binghatti Holding. Kachonara, really good to have you with us on the show. I know there's been a lot of talk about the impact this war could have on property prices, so we appreciate you coming on the show to talk about it. The first question I want to ask you is, how has buyers' behavior changed? Are they holding off decisions? Are they postponing decisions? What are you seeing?
Well, Jumana, thank you for having me. One thing we need to remember is that we are only 4 weeks into this conflict. So let's talk about what we've seen during those 4 weeks. From an overall market view, we've seen just shy of 15,200 transactions in the market. If we zoom into Binghatti's portfolio, and of course, we are prioritizing the projects that we have slated for completion this year. And if we look at those projects are on average about 90% sold. And in terms of price behavior or client behavior or market behavior, let's remember that behavior is always driven by liquidity, and there still is liquidity in the market. And even the inventory in terms of listings, a lot of the inventory that we are seeing in terms of listings is actually relistings. In fact, over about 60 to 65% of it is actually relistings. So in terms of, market behavior, the behavior still seems relatively stable.
And what are some of the scenarios that you're accounting for in terms of decline in collections, in terms of the average drop in selling prices? Can you walk us through some of the baseline scenarios that you're looking at here?
Absolutely. So this is really important. In light of the circumstances, the first thing that we did actually as a company is a stress testing model. And the most important outcome of that stress testing model is liquidity. And that's, in reference to the calls that you were referring to earlier, that is the main central theme of these calls is stress testing liquidity. And, one of the things that we do when we build these models is test the sensitivity of our liquidity relative to price and price corrections. And we've actually modeled price corrections that go as far as 20 to 30% in terms of price drops, which is a very aggressive assumption, but the company remains relatively healthy from a liquidity standpoint. The other thing is, when we talk about worst case scenarios, one of the things that is out of our control is how long the conflict carries on for. And the most important factor in terms of modeling the sensitivity in terms of how long the conflict goes for is an important factor that a lot of people are not talking about is the split between residents versus non-residents. And the reason this is important relative to how long the conflict goes on for is even if the demand from non-residents softens, the actual lion's share of our demand is from UAE residents. So that's an important factor in terms of demand dynamics. There's a larger weightage assigned to actual UAE residents as opposed to non-residents.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. I was going to ask you about whether you've seen a shift in nationalities. What about in terms of the divergence in demand between sort of mid-level and luxury? Are you seeing anything notable there?
So this is an important point as well, actually, and I'm glad you're asking about this, Jumana, because one thing to remember is when we're talking about the nationality of buyers or the divergence between luxury versus non-luxury products, it's important to contextualize the portfolio of Binghatti, because traditionally there's been a lot of focus, and I think we've attracted a lot of attention for our branded uber luxury projects, but not to forget that over 2/3 of our portfolio is made up of mainstream and mid-luxury projects. And those types of projects are much more resilient, and they're a lot less speculative. So that's why we haven't actually seen a large shift in terms of nationality or even a large shift in terms of sales because of that skew towards mainstream and mid-luxury product.
But just on that point, how much of is that underpinned by population growth? And I've been in the region for the last 2 years, and I feel like every conversation we've had about property, we've talked about the influx of new people coming into the region. How much of the outlook is underpinned by population in the UAE continuing to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, pre-conflict, we were talking about that with our fixed income investors as well. We were talking about the 2040 Urban Master Plan, the D33 agenda. And I think one of the things that the UAE and the Dubai government has been very smart about is actually creating domestic demand, even pre-conflict. In fact, as early as 2024, when the CFO and I would go on these roadshows and speak to fixed income investors, we were actually, even as early as 2024, talking about latent demand and demand coming from within the UAE as opposed to just this influx of population or inward migration that's coming into the UAE. So we saw a lot of long-term tenants or people who have traditionally been tenants for so many years actually become homeowners. And this was actually encouraged by for example, the first-time home buyers program, which was launched by the DET in partnership with the Dubai Land Department. So I think a significant portion of that demand is actually underpinned domestically.
Katronada, real pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of, I'm sure, a very busy time for you. Katronada Binghatti, CEO and Managing Director of Binghatti Holding.